Welcome to the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. Today we are going to be talking about tapering. We're going to talk about fitness plateaus. We're also going to be talking about doping, and we're going to talk about a handful of other things. It's going to be great, really cool episode here. And we have Hannah Otto joining us. So racing for Pivot Cycles, DT Swiss, competitive cyclist. Good to have you, Hannah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Before we go any further, I want to talk to you about your racing, because since we had you on just before BWR Utah, effectively. Mm-hmm. But since then, you've raced BWR Utah, you've raced Sea Otter, you've raced Whiskey Off-Road. And I want to hear what you've learned from each one of those. So first, BWR Utah, the weather was like super in question coming into that race. It was a long race. They ended up shortening it slightly, but it was still a long course, mm-hmm. and pretty tough course. If I remember correctly, you came in fourth on that one.
Yes. Yeah.
And you mentioned that it was one of those days where it was like, it was not a day where it came easy. And I want to talk about that because I think that everybody, when they're in that situation, when they're racing, you think you're the only one that feels like you're just having an off day. So I want to find out like how you figured out it was an off day and then how you rallied against that.
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, it definitely was not an A race. It was more within the scope of my season. It's so hard to label races nowadays because BWR is obviously a huge series. So you never just go, and it's a long race. So you don't just go in like, oh, I don't care. So I don't want to make it sound like that. But I think that's maybe the important point here is just because something is a quote unquote C event doesn't mean you don't care. It just means this is how you've structured your training around it because you have bigger goals. And for me, with Sea Otter, the first race of the Lifetime Series being just 2 weeks later, I wasn't going to taper into BWR and then, turn around and taper into Sea Otter. So I was approaching it more like a C event. So I knew going into it that I wasn't at 100%, but you still want to perform. And I think that's an important thing for people to hear is it's totally fine to label something as a C event and still show up with the desire to perform. It doesn't mean you can't perform. It just means you have to have those expectations in check. And so I think that was kind of the story of the day, right? Is keeping those expectations in check and not allowing it to shake confidence for the races that you are targeting. Because I know that this is my performance on this day. It doesn't mean it's my best possible performance ever. It's just the best I can do today. And I think that isn't in and of itself is an opportunity to learn and improve because you can work on other things like pack dynamics. How can I stay in this group when maybe I have a little bit less power today, right? Like how can I take advantage of these other things in order to make up for whatever I might be lacking today? And with the cold weather, they also changed the course where they shortened it a little bit. And what they took out were the climbs because they didn't want it to go to higher elevation, which does make sense because it would be colder at higher elevation. So right. It was a strategy that made sense. But for me, it made for a very flat race, which is also not something that I would personally consider a strength. So again, I just had to refocus those expectations and think of it as an opportunity to learn and grow rather than fixating on your shortcomings.
So post-race, after you had finished fourth, I'm sure there were moments in your brain where it still wanted to make that C race an A race.
Oh, absolutely.
And where you, like you said, where you at some point wanted to be like, fourth, okay. So I finished it behind these people, and this is where I'm going to finish for the rest of the season. This is just where I am. So what was your response to those intrusive thoughts? What was your response post-race to be able to manage that? Because it's one thing to go in with those expectations properly set, and even in the race, maybe to manage them. But then afterward, when we have time to think about it, a lot of the time, that's when it sneaks in on us.
Yeah, I mean, that's the harsh reality, right? And especially with all these negative dialogues, like you're only as good as your last race, and those things that we hear and we know aren't true, but yet they still continually ring in our head. So for me, and this might not be the case for everyone, but for me, I really rely on data at that point, because for me, that's something that I can ground myself in. So I could look at my file from BWR Utah and say, it's not my best. It's not my best.
I like that.
And that's a good thing, because that means I have more. And so then I could look back at, whether it be other races or other training, and prove to myself, see, you do have more than what you showed on that day. And you know what? You're going to show it on the day that you already identified as really important to you.
Man, that's such a good perspective. So, because looking at the data, some people look at the data as a confirmation of the fact that this is where they are. I love your perspective of looking at it and saying, oh, okay, this isn't my best. Here's an objective measure of it, and it shows that it isn't my best. That means that I have more. That is a fantastic perspective to have. And that's one that we should have. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're seeing that for a lot of athletes at the top level in terms of, and even below the top level, all of us just average Janes and Joes listening to this that are going through situations where we're racing early season and our performance isn't where we might expect it to be. I like that perspective, thinking ahead to, hey, I've got more than this. I'm going to tap into it. That's super cool. You went to Sea Otter after that. Mm-hmm. And Hannah, for a lot of people, I would recommend that they race Sea Otter being willing to lose the entire race on the start, right? And because of the fact that afterward you get caught up, and it's kind of like a no passing zone. It's really tough to pass. Mm-hmm. And then the nature of that course is that there are really fast sections, and the whole course is fast, so that makes it harder to pass than a slow course. But there are many sections where extended periods of time where your competition's not going to let you by without you really getting creative and risking something and putting out a huge effort through grass or something, and who knows what you're going to hit in the grass.
Right.
So it's because it's tough to pass, it's crucial to make sure that you're with that group. However, Hannah, I didn't see you do that start where you just took off from the gun, and instead I saw you pick your way through the field, and I was just super impressed with how measured and intentional you were with that race, because that one, it takes guts to race it that way. Mm-hmm. You could say it takes guts to race it in the sense of just going all out on the first climb too, but I think it takes way more confidence in oneself to be nope, I don't need to sprint to the top of that hill and be the first one into the first turn because I trust something about myself. Was that intentional? How did that race unfold for you? Because I was just super impressed with how you just ticked your way all the way up and worked your way into that good position.
Well, I was third into the single track.
You were
so
third?
It wasn't, yeah.
I totally missed it. I thought that you were further back than that.
No.
Did you get shuffled back in maybe it was the timing checks that I saw. Did you get shuffled back at all in the beginning after into the single track?
No.
So you did sprint hard at the beginning.
Yeah, it was, sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. It must have been the timing checks. So what made you decide to sprint hard? Was it just the same thing I laid out before? Was the fact that it's hard to pass and you wanted to be with the right group?
Yeah, it's still a measured approach. I think what you're saying still applies, and that's an interesting dynamic, I think, within that entire group is, I think, objectively speaking, in order to place well at Sea Otter, barring the fact that, yes, of course, there's always the person who can have that phenomenal effort and move through the field and yada, yada, yada. But generally speaking, you need to be top 10 into that single track. But so everyone goes for it, but the level of effort that it takes for each person to go for it is different. So you can feel as you're sprinting for that single track that some people are doing their 3-minute best effort power. And when they hit that single track, they will have no option but to sit up because that's it. Versus other people, they might be going at, not power numbers, but just feeling wise, 80, 90%, where it's okay, I'm going to back off a little bit, but not implode. And so I think it's a little bit of a measured approach there. That's something where we did see Sophia go off the front at the very start, and it obviously worked for her. So kudos to her. In my mind, in that moment, I thought it would come back together. So I felt like I didn't need to expend that extra energy to go with that move, because historically in the race, it has always come back together. So for me, once I was in that top 5 for the single track, I felt really good about my position. At that point, I was able to, I don't want to say sit up because you're always pushing, but mentally kind of sit up like, okay, we've done it. Check, next thing on the list of things you need to do in this race. And then it became a big race of group dynamics and tactics, which was very exciting, and a lot different than what we usually get in a mountain bike race.
Yeah, it's because you have those sections where it really like spreads, it gives you the space to be able to go really fast. Even like it'll branch out into like a Jeep trail fire road sort of scenario, and you can get really high speed. But then after, when it goes to single track, it's not like it's chill. Like you're having to be really diligent to make sure you don't drop wheels, right? Like it's a lot of like hard work while that's happening. So you sprint for that, you get into that position, and looking at that race, in like Sophia, like you said, she sprinted off, she went really fast. And then after that, she ended up coming back in. Like I should say Alexis and her made contact, whether it was Alexis moving up or Sophia dropping back, I'm not sure. I don't trust any of the live timing now after.
Yeah. So we were in a group, and Alexis and I, we were in a group of several people, and Alexis actually asked me, is there anyone up the road? And I said, Sophia is. And nearly immediately, Alexis made a move. It was very distinct that this
Shifted
was her,
gears and dropped the clutch.
Exactly, that this was her mission. And it was an interesting moment for me, because you only have a split second in that moment to make the decision. And I felt like, we were in a group of maybe 5 or 6, and I felt like the chances that the group of 5 or 6 would reel Sophia back in were pretty high. I mean, after one lap, we were only 30 seconds down. So we could still see her on many of the sections, and it felt like it made sense that if the group worked together, we could catch her. So when Alexis made that move, my thought was, I'm going to let Alexis expend that energy to bridge that gap to Sophia on her own. And hopefully then this group will in turn catch both of them. That's not exactly how the race played out. We did end up catching Alexis again, but the interesting thing is, when you make a decision like that, the decision that I made is part of my decision is banking on other people. It's not just myself. And within that, there are group dynamics that come into play of, does everyone have that same desire to catch the front? Is everyone willing to work together to catch the front? Because someone has to be willing to make that first move. If I sit on the front for 2 minutes, I'm counting on someone else coming around and sitting on the front for 2 minutes. Because if they don't, I have now put myself in a hole that puts me on the back foot within that group. And now not only might we not reach the 2 people off the front, but I'm now at a disadvantage within my group, and I could finish back within the group. And I think these are all the fears that are going through the group's mind that makes it so we don't quite work like a well-oiled machine. And even if we are sort of working together, even these small hitches where someone pulls through, they do their 2 minutes, they pull off, they look around, and everyone goes, so are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? Finally, someone else goes through. It's time lost. It's time lost again.
10, 15 seconds right there.
And it really adds up. And I think that is a lot of what we saw happening, particularly in the second lap. Like I said, that first lap, we came through 35 seconds behind. Makes sense. Still early in the race. We're still driving, pushing. As it gets closer to the finish, everyone's looking around going, are you more tired than me? Am I more tired than you? Wanting to save those matches, hedge their bets. And that's why you start to see the gaps sort of grow and diminish according to how those things are playing out.
Yeah, because from the outside in, Hannah, I would say that there were 3 athletes like you, Alexis and Sophia were the three athletes that were expected to crush it, right? And as a result, if I'm those other athletes that are in the group with you, I'm like, hey, like Hannah, like you're one of the three here. You do the pulling to catch up, right? Like, and they probably wouldn't be the ones to do it. So it would end up being on you. That's the tricky part, right? When you're in a situation like that and somebody makes the move and you decide to sit back and then you realize later on that like, oh, everybody in that group was going to relying on me. They were always going to rely on me to be the one to make that move. So like, you know, it's hard. It's hard to like weigh those decisions in the moment. And I think that that's always really impressive to see with like athletes that are very experienced, particularly in road racing. You know, they know like they're constantly running all the game theory calculations constantly in their minds and they just can make the right decisions so often and not miss those moves. And it's really impressive to see. And it's really tough to do. But yeah, you were definitely marked, I would think. Like you were the one that they were like, yeah, she's going to pull us up there. So.
Oh, that's a funny thought. I like that though. That's a good thing. But I think you're right. I think we're all, you know, I think Sophia's a very smart racer. I think when she went off the front, she was probably banking on those negative group dynamics behind her to a certain extent. And then, like you're saying, Alexis, maybe she knew that people would rely on her. So she decided to make the move and put it in her own hands. It paid off for Sophia. Alexis ended up not being able to maintain it on the final climb and ended up 5th instead of that 1st or 2nd place move. So I think that's super fun. I think it's just really awesome to see how it all plays out because I think at this point where we're at in the Grand Prix, everyone is so fast. And we're seeing, you know, times objectively are so much faster. I think power numbers are higher. We're seeing an elevated playing field. And so these minute details and decisions are going to be very highlighted, which I think is super exciting. And I also hope, you know, going back to what we just talked about, like looking at data, relying on data to be an informative thing is I also really hope that athletes are finding satisfaction in their numbers. I feel like because the races are getting faster and maybe some people aren't quite placing where they hope to, there's a negative dialogue around, oh, I had a bad day. I finished whatever it might be, 10th, 15th, 20th, whatever that is. But man, if your power numbers were 15 watts higher and you were 8 minutes faster than last year, I just really encourage all of those athletes to still take pride in that because the whole field is elevating and everyone will elevate and improve at different times and different, it takes different amounts of time and different jumps to make. And as long as you're improving, it's a victory. So don't lose sight of that.
Yeah, we recently recorded an episode of the podcast with Sevilla Blanc. If you didn't listen to that one, it's a short interview, a special episode that we did. And, you know, she's in a unique situation where her position relative to other people absolutely matters. Like, it's everything because of going for the Olympics, right? We talked about how balancing that with being process-driven and everything else goes. And if you're in the Lifetime Grand Prix, I know that also, like, you're paid to race your bike and do well. But at the same time, I feel like it isn't live or die by the fact that you placed in X position. And instead, it's also like a longer series and it really makes sense, like you said, to be more process driven and look at the objective feedback of what you actually did and to take it from there. There's just so much that can happen in these long races too, you know, that they can change things up. So you went to Whiskey Off-Road after that, the Epic Rides Whiskey Off-Road. And I still haven't done that race. Really want to. It looks amazing.
That's crazy that you haven't done that race.
I know.
I feel like it's such a good race for you.
I know. I really want to do it. Every year I want to, and then I don't put it on the calendar, and I need to do it. So, and the organizer of that series, Todd Sadow, I consider him a great friend as well, and I love how he does his races. He does a great job. So
absolutely.
Yeah, let's make it happen in 2025. So, but you had like a reunion with Alexis Scarta there.
Yeah.
And such a cool sprint finish, by the way. I'll try to link down below to that video. Hopefully it wasn't just a story. Hopefully it's on Instagram, but long sprint finish and everything else. But before we get to the sprint finish between you and Alexis, I want to talk about that race. So like, coming from BWR Utah, then to Sea Otter, and then coming into this one, and going back to this perspective that we had at BWR that like, hey, like I have more, and you performed well at Sea Otter, and then coming into BW or into whiskey, had you changed? Had you thought that like, okay, I see evidence of me doing more now, and I'm ready to go, and I'm ready to fight for the win? Because that, I mean, you were right there the whole entire race with that.
Totally. I think whiskey for me was a lot of racing with confidence. You know, I knew that I made improvements in the off season, but I think there's a difference when you see it play out in the races. And at Sea Otter, I think it was an opportunity for me to see that fitness play out and feel it play out too. And so at whiskey, I knew I have the ability to race for the win here. And so I'm going to, you know, whether or not I achieve that is something different, but to race with the mindset of I want to win today, I think it's something special. And I think that confidence can really make a big difference in, again, those decisions that you make out there. If your plan and your goal is to win, you're going to make different strategic moves than you do otherwise. And so that was definitely more of my mindset at whiskey. Yeah,
and Alexis is she's very good at that sort of course too, in the sense that like big long climbs, it's got technical stuff. She's a good mountain bike rider, good skills and everything else too. So you are going up against like somebody that's like kind of in their turf and in their wheelhouse, right? Like that's like very much her sort of racing. What did you learn from that race? And maybe it's just like from the sprint finish, you have learnings in particular, but were there any learnings before then that you had that you feel like nuggets of wisdom or learning that you took from that race?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like you said, Alexis is very skilled at that course in particular. And so I think you can approach it a couple different ways when you know that of an athlete coming in. Either you can sort of try and mimic them, you know, mimicry is the best form of flattery, right? Like she knows how to do it, so I'm just going to copy her. Or you can take a step back and, you know, if she's so good at these things and this is how she races, maybe I don't want to put myself up exactly against that hand of cards. And so you can sort of try and race the race, put it more in your field or race your own race. And I felt like that was something that I was able to do really well at whiskey this year. You know, they altered since there was no fat tire crit due to the weather, they put a preem at the start of the single track, which comes somewhere between 5 and 7 miles into the race. So it's not just like a quick hole shot like Sea Otter. It's a significant, or it can be a significant effort if the field decides to make it one. And we definitely started hot on the day, very, very fast. And I felt like for me, I wanted to remain within relative contact of that group, but without absolutely blowing myself up, because I had pretty good confidence in my legs coming up Skull Valley. If I got there in like within myself, right? And so I actually allowed a small gap to form on that first single track and then re-bridged the gap before Skull Valley. And I felt like that allowed me to enter in at the bottom of Skull Valley feeling fresh, confident, good about myself so that I could actually drive that pace up Skull Valley and, in my view, kind of take the race into my hand of cards rather than playing into someone else's.
Yeah, it's smart and a good move to make. The sprint finish coming down into it, how'd that go? You were set up, as I recall, coming into the last turn, surprisingly, like Alexis didn't take the inside and you had the inside into the last turn.
Yeah.
Walk me through it.
Yeah, I think... Man, this is so brutal. Like anytime you lose a sprint finish, you're like, what have I done? Right. So yeah, I mean, I'm also like, I'm curious from the outside looking in what the perspective was. But for me, I so I exited the single track in first, and with her on my wheel, like we were very much together. And it's about 4 miles into town, and most of it is a relatively downhill gradient. And I didn't really want to be leading that, but nobody does. So it was also one of those things where I know she, like, what motivation would she have to come around to me at that point? And so I led most
you had
of
a gap, right? You two had a gap.
We had a several minute gap. So we had room to play with. And so we were, I'm looking back a lot over my shoulder, looking at her, and she's just looking at me like, yeah, go ahead. And so, I was leading most of that way. And I think a lot of my mindset was around the fact that it felt like I was just going to end up leading her out. And so and ultimately that is, I think, what ended up happening. But what I attempted to do was sprint before the final corner in hopes that she would sprint me, come around, and then I would come around again. But there wasn't enough room after that final corner. I think whoever enters that final corner first is probably the one who gets it. And by taking the outside line, she was actually able to carry more momentum around that corner versus when she passed me on the outside and I was on the inside, I actually had to slow up a little bit or I would have drifted into her. And so all of those things were learnings for sure.
Yeah, because your sprint technique, by the way, looks really cool, like really good.
Oh, thanks.
It was cool to see in the video. And yeah, it is like not knowing the context from it. I'm like, wow, it looks like Hannah's come into this one doing more work because it looks like she started to hit her peak and started to like your power started to probably drop before Alexis's did. And I figured that was probably the case. Like there was some sort of long lead in where you were probably in front for a longer period of time. It's always tricky, right? And like you said, you already look back and you're like, yeah, like I would not want to be leading and doing all that. But it was a really exciting finish to watch.
Oh, it was so exciting. And Alexis is an awesome competitor. So it was super fun. So yeah, all in all, I'm super happy with the start of the season. I mean, for me, I think, just such fun, dynamic races. I mean, it's so motivating to start the year with that type of stuff. So I can't wait.
It's awesome. Yeah, it's cool. So what's next? What's the next race for you?
For me, the next race is Unbound.
Amazing.
Yeah, and it'll be my first time ever at Unbound. So I'm super excited it's just not that often now in my career that I get to call myself a newbie or a rookie. So I'm like fully wearing that badge at Unbound, and I think that's fun. And I'm hoping that ignorance is bliss a little bit, and maybe that'll give me like a little extra power just because I don't quite know all of the difficulties that you can face out there, like someone else who might be a little more jaded from experiences. So one can hope.
Yeah. It always seems like every year, and it's not a consistent thing, like it's a mud section or something, but there's always some defining course thing in the first, in the first hour, which is just crazy, first hour to 2 hours. For a lot of you who are listening to this, like race crits, and you're like, that's like 3 crits. But in the first 2 hours is usually some defining moment that's usually caused by a course feature or something, whether it's extreme wind, whether it's extreme mud, or just a really rough section. And then I feel like the split is made. Then after that, the split stays the split. And that's just kind of what it is. But I don't know, because the course changes every year, they either go north or they go south, but it still changes within that. So I'm really excited for it. I'm excited to cheer for you. It'll be great.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. Hannah, we got a lot of questions this week, and if you want to submit your questions, you can do so at trainerroad.com/podcast, or go to Spotify and you can just submit them right there. That's where you can listen and watch the podcast too. It's really handy because if you use Spotify and whatever apps you're using, it just picks up right where you left off. It's really cool, and you can watch or listen. So, and if you're listening on any of those apps, please review us, give us 5 stars. And if we don't deserve 5 stars, let us know what we can do to get 5 stars, and we'll do that for you. That helps people find the podcast, helps people sign up with TrainerRoad, and we'll continue doing this. But a lot of questions came in this week about tapering. Makes sense because people are like getting ready for racing this time of year. So instead of going into the individual questions themselves and like each one, I just kind of like looked at them and then summarized, and hopefully this can be helpful to a lot of you that were sending in questions for this. So Hannah, I want to get your perspective, and then I'll just share any parts that I feel like could be additive to it thereafter. But how do you taper for an event? And then how does that depend on the priority of the event? Earlier, we were talking about C races and A races, that sort of thing. But for you, in short, we'll get into more of the details, I guess, a little bit later. But some people like to keep the intensity high and just keep training through. Some people don't. How do you taper for an event?
Yeah, this is something I feel like we've played with and by we, I mean my coach and I have played with for my entire career, because I think that it is something that changes with an athlete, and it's going to change also according to how much volume you're putting in on a daily, weekly, yearly basis, and how much intensity you can handle and all of these things. So a taper is super unique for an athlete. It's also unique because everyone, when we line up on race day, we're very fixated often on how we feel. Rightly so in some cases, overanalyzed in others. And so that's also what makes you feel good, and what makes you feel confident are definitely very real factors to take into consideration with your taper. And then how often you race is also a huge factor. So with a C event, you're not tapering at all. You're just training straight through it. With a B race, in my opinion, you might have, 1 or 2 easier days leading into it. And then an A race is where, okay, we're doing a full on taper. And what that taper looks like is going to vary based on all of those things I just said. So typically a taper could be anywhere from like a 2-week taper to what I call more of a drop dead taper, which is going to be a lot more intense. And by intense, I mean like you're training, and then boom, now we're not. We're like easy spin, rest day, race. And that's just, so maybe anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks of tapering. And the goal of it is to shed fatigue, but to lose as little fitness as possible across that. So if you're doing a 2-week taper, that means that you're going to be having a little bit more volume and intensity, because you can't just keep it easy spins for 2 weeks, or you're going to lose a lot of fitness. If you're doing a shorter taper, then it's going to be, like I said, drop dead. You're going to be easy spin or off day in order to shed that fatigue really, really fast. So generally speaking, a taper is going to maintain intensity. You don't want to just cut all intensity out. That's where we see, still these shorter efforts like openers even, but a lower volume. So you're going to do anywhere from like you're going to cut like 60 to 90% of your volume during your taper. And then another thing to consider is so while you're cutting that volume, you only want to decrease your frequency of riding by like 30 to 50%. So that doesn't mean, oh, okay, I will take 4 days off this week and then do 3 really big rides. You still want to maintain that frequency, and instead actually just cut down all of the rides a little bit across the board.
Yeah, the maintaining intensity part, I think, is counterintuitive to those that haven't done it before. But then once you have done that, you understand why. That helps you maintain the sort of fitness that you're talking about, the race applicable fitness above all. And because that's the stuff that drops off faster than the aerobic fitness. The aerobic fitness takes longer to build, and it also takes longer to drop off. Whereas the anaerobic fitness, it doesn't take that long to build, and it also drops off really quickly. So that's why, that's why it's that case. And this is an interesting point about not making sure that you're not going from 3 days of riding a week to 1 day of riding a week, but instead maintaining the 3 days, just it's, shorter workouts that you're doing. And this is, I feel like with TrainerRoad and everything else, it builds in tapering for you, and it takes care of it, so you don't have to worry about it. But I think there's also, like, for those that are more experienced, and if you're going through this, there's room for customization intentionally with that sort of thing, with adaptive training, so that you can go in there, and if you feel like, I typically always perform better when I do a touch more intensity than what I'm getting right now, then you can use just the alternates feature, and you can select a workout that's a bit more. If it's a bit less, you can do a bit less. But I think that it's important to listen to past experiences, blend that with listening to your body. But you mentioned something really important, Hannah. Like, we change as time goes on. And I don't know about you, but every year I kind of need to figure out how my body's responding to training and tapering differently. And it changes. And
100%.
I'll do certain things. You mentioned, and on to like the next point on this, you mentioned the fact that you were trying to do things to make you feel ready. And I want to talk about like the non-training aspects of your life and the things that you do to help yourself feel ready. Do you like, I don't know if you cut out dog walks or if you like cut out strength training, that sort of thing, or what you do, but how do you adjust all the other things that aren't training on the bike when you're in a taper?
Yeah, I think this has actually been one of the biggest things that I've, aside from training, that I've changed over the last few years that I've seen a huge benefit from. And I think it can be a challenge, especially for a non-professional athlete, because life doesn't stop when you race. But I think that to taper the rest of your life is huge in leading into an event. And for me, I mean, that's across the board. So limiting stress, I think it's a very subjective thing, but I think that you have to be really aware of within your body in the week leading into the race, or maybe even just a couple days leading into the race, what's causing you stress and how can you separate yourself from that in this time? I mean, do you have the ability? A lot of the times if you're traveling for a big event or something, maybe you're taking a day or two off work to travel for that event anyways. So maybe that's a time where, hey, I'm not going to look at my email at all for these 2 days leading into the race. And for me, I think a big lesson on this has been, since life does not stop leading into a race, to rely on others, to communicate to the people around me who can help me and support me that, hey, for these next 2 or 3 days, if something's stressing me out, I'm going to place it on you. Whether or not that means that they, do something physically for me, or just they can shoulder that burden of, hey, this is stressing me out. I'm going to tell you so that I don't have to think about it anymore. I think that is hugely helpful. And then, if those people can help you, maybe you have to keep working. Like, that's not an option. Like, I have to work all the way up till the race. Maybe they can take those other things off your plate. Like, can they cook you dinner that night? Can you make sure that you bring your bike to the bike shop the week before so that you're not tinkering with it the night before? Like, really limiting these things that can create issues. And I think that also goes for, I personally lay out my equipment like a week before, because it's not just about having it ready. It's about, if something's wrong, I want space to be able to fix that in a non-stressful situation.
Yes.
And so I think
ordering parts might take a week.
Exactly.
More.
And so I think preparing ahead of time for me is a really key and important thing in limiting stress in the days leading up to the race.
That's such a crucial part of like the communication side and everything else, doing it beforehand. That's the key. Like, you have to like look ahead and anticipate what could go wrong. And then you have to build against it with the people around you. And if you wait too late to do that, it isn't effective. And if you are trying to stress, like basically instead of relying on other people, if you just pass it all onto yourself, you're going to have a horrendous week before the race week, right? Because you're trying to do 2 weeks worth of stuff at once. And that's going to compromise probably a very key training week for you. So, and it's hard because somebody's listening to this and they're like, I don't have a support system and I don't have that sort of thing. And so everything kind of scales to each person individually in terms of what you can do. But the principle remains that what you want to do is you want to minimize your dependencies during that week so that you don't have additional responsibilities. And then also just minimize all that allostatic load, all the other stress that comes in. I guess the other side of it too, though, and I'm curious for you on this, because I think that, and as time goes on, we're seeing more research come out about this, but how do you manage like social media and distractions and everything else? Because a lot of the time with pro athletes, you know, like you get your feet up, you just need something to distract you to get your feet up and to force you to lay down and recover and do all that. And during a recovery week, you'll have more time to do that. But just, you know, doom scrolling on social media or just being involved in that world can introduce a totally different level of stress and if you have more free time and you're spending more time on that, it could be really bad, like building into. Do you do like a fast, so to speak, of social media, or do you decrease any of that coming into a race week?
I would say I decrease it. I mean, I think that some athletes have really specific rules around it. Like I don't get, you know, someone might say I don't get on social media for 2 days before the race or something. I don't have hard and fast rules like that, but I do try and be really intentional about what I'm taking in and from what sources. You know, there's also things in the professional world like who to watch, racing lists that come out. And those things can be disorienting in the days leading up to a race, whether or not you're on it, whether or not someone you know is on it, whether someone you didn't consider is coming to the race, oh my gosh, now they're on it. Like all of these things can spin you out. And so I think for me, I've started to limit what I take in on that front for sure before races because it doesn't matter. Those things just don't matter. What matters is how you are preparing, and that applies across the board from amateurs to professionals. There's nothing that anybody else is doing leading into a race that should impact how you lead in to your race. And so all of that extra stuff is just noise, and you have to decide for yourself of whether or not that noise is entertainment or whether it's actually impacting you.
Yeah, that's crucial. The individual awareness part is crucial because a lot of the time we're just scrolling through and we don't really recognize it until later on. It's just like, oh, why am I feeling so down? You know? But I think it can really like weigh in a time where we're tempted to like place judgments on ourselves. Like you said, how am I feeling going into this race? How am I going to do? And in those sort of moments, we're going to look for signals everywhere. And if you go to social media, you will be inundated with signals, like just completely inundated and overwhelmed with them. So I think that can be a tricky thing to balance. And even subconsciously, you might not realize it, but it can be harming you quite a lot. So
I think even all the way up until the start line too. I mean, I think that especially I see a lot of young athletes, especially in warm up. It's actually really funny. If you stand around and watch people warming up, you will notice that people mimic each other. And I think that everyone is staying within some limits, but there is an element of, well, they just got on the trainer, I'm going to get on the trainer, or they just got off the trainer, am I late? You know? And so I think that this also goes back to having your plan. I like to write it down because that really feels like it binds me to it. And then when I'm in those moments where I'm starting to get this outside feedback, I can go back to what I've already written down for myself and hold myself accountable.
Nice. What about on the nutrition side of things? Because that's, again, I think that you could look at this like you have, let's say that you train 10 hours a week, and now your training has dropped from 10 hours a week and you're doing something like 4 hours that week, right? So suddenly you have 6 hours that you didn't have. It can be filled with anything, bad or good. And I feel like nutrition side of things, that's a great opportunity to dedicate more time to like making the sort of food that you want and the sort of like the nourishing stuff and doing that. But do you have any things that you do with nutrition in particular when you're in a taper?
Yeah, I mean, when you're tapering, you are generally burning less calories. And so generally speaking, you know, just on a calorie in, calorie out basis, you need less. But we have to then zoom out from that as well. So for me, competing in a lot of these longer endurance and marathon style races, usually when I'm tapering, that also means it's a time to start carb loading. And so I have to be really intentional about my nutrition because I might be burning less calories. And so I have maybe potentially less of an appetite, but now's the time to actually be in surplus. I need to be loading on glycogen. And so I think the taper is actually a time when you have to be very intentional about your nutrition and maybe even push yourself a little bit outside of your comfort zone in comparison to when you are training hard, the appetite might just naturally come. But when you're tapering, you really have to think about what you're tapering for and what those demands will be.
Yeah, I feel like in addition to carb loading, sodium loading, I feel like can be really helpful for a lot of athletes too. We're talking, this is like day before, so this isn't, throughout the entire week you need to be doing this, but just since we're talking about carb loading, I think that's a crucial thing. And the carb loading side of things, like you want to be taking in things that are going to be relatively lower in fiber that you would tip than you would normally eat, because that's going to reduce the amount of trips you have to go to the bathroom, right? And that's going to help your digestion become more, I guess, like consistent and everything else, and spread out when you're going through a race, which will be helpful. But within that, you want to be taking in like 2 to 3 days before is what seems like the current body of research indicates is when you want to be starting to increase your carb intake. And I think one of the most practical ways of carb loading is to make sure that like coming into, as you start to add things on, adding on extra carbs can be really easy and not blow up your gut. Because a lot of the time we think I just need a massive plate of food now because I'm carb loading, when in reality it's eat the same plate of food that you had. But if it had pasta or it had rice or it had something else like that, if it had like, some sort of bread, have a bit extra of that and just add on a little bit extra with every meal. And then little by little, that can start to get to the point where you can really get, you have a whole lot more carbohydrate coming into your system. So it's like an extra little bowl of rice, an extra little thing of pasta, whatever it might be. And
I actually really like sneaky carbs too during that time. So like sometimes even I might eat the exact same plate of pasta or rice, but then I'll drink a big glass of juice. And for me, that's for that particular meal of the day, that might be all that I need in order for that extra. So it doesn't have to be complicated. And like you're saying, it doesn't have to be a big gut bomb of, oh my gosh, I'm sitting down for this massive feast the night before the race. It doesn't have to be that complicated. All we're trying to do is add in just a little bit. Like I almost think of, I have this visual of like, when I'm doing this carbo load of like the rice and pasta is like the marbles in the glass. And then like the juice or whatever I'm adding in is like filling in the space between those marbles. And so that's kind of what my mindset is as I'm thinking about what can I add here to like fill in those extra spaces without packing in more marbles on top that are like overflowing. How am I just filling in the gaps?
I love that. That's great. Anything else that you do or like you find yourself thinking of or focusing on during a taper?
I try and be really intentional about sleep as well during taper. And I think that that's an interesting one because I think sometimes the more we think about sleep, the more stressed we become about sleep and then the less that we sleep. I hear athletes all the time feel nervous before a race that I'm nervous that I won't sleep the night before the race. And that is always, you're so validated. I think we all feel that, but it's always like such a catch-22 because the second you start being nervous that you're not going to sleep, might not sleep. And so I try and take the pressure off of that night before by having a really good week of sleep leading up. Nice. And then actually like it usually ends up making that night before good because I'm not stressed about it, but that's just a nice benefit. So I think the whole week leading up, being more intentional about your sleep. And for me, that's really creating space around sleep and having a really good wind down time. It doesn't necessarily mean like, oh my gosh, now I'm going to sleep at 8 instead of 10. It just means when I go to sleep at, let's say you're going to sleep at 10, it means I'm winding down so that I'm actually asleep at 10. I'm not staying up reeling about what I just read or the email I just saw or all the work I have to do tomorrow. I'm really trying to create an area of restfulness around that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Great tips, Hannah. I don't have anything else to add. I feel like it was very comprehensive and fantastic. So
awesome.
I want to get into, so hopefully that's helped everybody with tapering questions or anything else. If you have questions on that, you can always submit them. When you write support@trainerroad.com or you go and you see the little chat box, it's a real person. Chances are they're a person that has a lot of experience helping you all and probably even riding or racing. I mean, we have like the winner of the Cape Town Cycle Tour, the men's and women's race. They both work for TrainerRoad. It's amazing. Biggest bike race in the world. Pretty sweet. So
That's awesome.
You can always rely on them and ask them, and they can help you through. Riker submitted a question, says, I'm a junior and feel like I'm hitting a plateau. What do you recommend to surge past this? I think it's interesting to see that language, surge past this, and be the best athlete I can possibly be. Love the podcast. Keep these great episodes coming. So thanks, Riker, for submitting that. The surge part really stands out to me because that in my mind, and many times when I'm in a plateau, when I first started out in cycling, I remember feeling like I needed to do more to break past the plateau. However, as time has gone on, and this is just speaking for me individually, I'm not saying this is the case for everybody. As time has gone on, it's often that I need to do less in a certain way in order to break through a plateau. But I'm curious, Hannah, what do you have for thoughts? What's worked for you when you hit plateaus and breaking through them? What's changed?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question because it is so broad. So it's difficult to give Riker a really specific, personalized answer. But the first thing that just came to mind is we just need to adjust training, period. Because the body needs novel stimulus in order to make improvements. And so my guess is if you've reached a plateau, especially as a junior, it's likely because you're doing a lot of the same things and your body has maximized the gains currently within that area. And so if we just adjust your training towards a different area, we'll start to see gains in that new area and therefore elevate all of your riding. And so that can be anything. And that's one of my favorite things about cycling is there's so many different areas to find improvements in. I mean, it could be as simple as improving your rest. Boom. Now we have, more energy to put onto the bike, breaking through the plateau. It could be a different type of workouts. Maybe you're just doing all threshold workouts and you've raised you've pushed up from the floor for a really long time. Maybe now we need to do VO2 and pull up from the ceiling. Like, can be something like that. If you're training, 1 hour twice a week, maybe it's time to add a third time a week. Maybe you've really maxed out the gains you can have from twice a week. Maybe you've never raced and you need to have other people or other, group rides to show you like, hey, you're not pushing quite as hard as you can. Maybe you need someone to motivate you to dig a little bit deeper to discover what you're really capable of. I think all of these things are changes that can, especially for a junior, I think generally speaking for most juniors, there's just so much room that honestly, you could probably do any and all of these things and see improvement, because my guess is you are so far in a very exciting way from reaching your potential that the gains are exponential ahead of you.
Yeah, and this is interesting because the basic principle is your body does need novel stimulus, like you said, right? And novel stimulus doesn't mean more all the time.
Exactly.
It might mean just different, like Hannah was saying. So that could just mean the fact that maybe you do the same, like Hannah said, the same type of workouts, like threshold workouts, but let's just say you're always doing just stable threshold efforts. Maybe switch it up with hard start threshold efforts or with over-unders, or for VO2 work, if you're just consistently doing, 2 to 5 minute VO2 intervals, and that's just what you do. Maybe it's time to change it up with 30-30s and do that instead, or change something up. And this is why I think it's really helpful, like on the TrainerRoad side with progression levels, like you can jump into a totally different type of VO2 workout that you have never done, but it will tell you which workouts are productive and stuff. And you can see the levels, like it's like you're a VO2 max level 4.2. So as a result, even though you haven't done 30-30s in a long time, this level 4.2 or 30-30s workout is going to be appropriately difficult. And I think that's something that not enough athletes play around with. Like you need to change up the stimulus sometimes and experiment and see what works. And that it's probably not a good idea to fill the cup like that's already too full, in the sense that if you're already doing a good amount of like intense work, like I don't think you need to go and switch your easy endurance day over to be another hard VO2 workout just to figure out how it works. Like that's not the day to do it. You want to swap it out when it is an intense day and figure that out. But I think that's a key thing to remember. But in kids' cases in particular, I see a lot of juniors doing a lot on the bike. And the cool part is your body is like magical when you're a teenager, and you can just like throw whatever you want at it and your body just deals with it. Right. Like aside from acne, they're superheroes. It's the only thing that gets us down when we're teenagers. Right. Otherwise we just continue to grow and adapt. And I think that you seem, in this case, Riker, like you want to surge past this thing and you want to push. And so I don't want to be presumptuous here, but it does seem that you are very driven and you want to improve that sort of thing. So while you're looking to create novel stimulus, I would also encourage you to look at how you can recover better. Like maybe a lot of this is coming from the fact that you aren't sleeping as much as you should. Maybe you aren't eating the sort of foods that you know or your body's going to absolutely love and be able to use to really rebuild and get stronger. Maybe there's just time where you're looking at it and you're hanging out with a friend group, and that friend group is pretty toxic and it's not helping you out. And it's a big source of stress. Like there's a lot of different things that could be causing you to just outside of the bike to just be nerfed and kind of stuck and always where you're at. So I would also look at the side of like, what can I do to recover better? It doesn't mean going and dunking yourself in cold water all the time or something like that. That just means that like maybe it's resting a little bit more than what you are doing.
Yeah, I also like that you pointed out the word surge, because the other thing that I thought of with that is in order to break a plateau, you don't have to surge past it. All we're looking for is steady, continuous improvement. And depending on where Riker's at in their career, it could be that they've been seeing, 10% increases year over year, and all of a sudden now they're only seeing 2%. That's still not a plateau. You're going to hit a point where the improvements are smaller year over year, but improvement is improvement. And so whether or not that's the case, I would still encourage you that as you work towards breaking this plateau, you don't have to be looking for a massive gain. Any gain is a victory. And so sometimes I think dialing back expectations can be helpful, because instead of seeking something so far in the distance that just keeps feeling like it just keeps getting further and farther, when we have very process-oriented goals that are a little bit closer, I think it becomes a lot easier to make a plan to reach those.
Yeah, that's really well said. Looking back, I'm not sure I don't feel like surge has ever described the experience of me dealing with a plateau.
Exactly.
Instead, it always feels like a block just melts away.
Yes.
Like where I'm stuck by something and held back, and then it's just gone. And it's like, oh, okay, I'm better. But it's never like I added so much more and I blew through it. Instead, it's usually like a small change in something. Oh, okay, I'm not capped anymore. So,
yeah. And sometimes it's almost unnoticeable. You're like, oh, well, that workout went well.
Yeah,
and then the next one goes well. And then the next one, it's like a snowball, right? It's like gaining momentum where all of a sudden it's rolling down the hill, but you're like, when did this happen? Oh, well, I am happy, right? It's like, it's not this big like switch that flips. It's just all of a sudden, oh, we're carrying momentum again. We're back.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, well said. Barry's question says, 5 stars for my favorite podcast. I discovered it back in 2014 and still listen to this day, which is something I can't say for any other podcast. Thanks for all the incredible information. Barry, if you've been listening since 2014, you've effectively been with us from the beginning of the podcast. That is astounding. Thank you. I appreciate that. Barry says, I've got a technical question for you. Over the years, the podcast has examined a lot of the marketing trends that have come and gone. Initially, it seemed like lightweight components were all the rage. Then aerodynamics, then rolling resistance and drivetrain resistance. But what now? It seems like there isn't some larger narrative that marketing departments are throwing at us. I bring this up because I still have a 2019 S-Works Venge. That's the aero road bike that Specialized made then. And don't feel like I have a single good reason to upgrade. So am I missing the trend du jour? Or is there something near on the horizon? What's the next bike engineering revolution that will make us all faster? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Hannah, especially because you are in the like mountain bike gravel side of things.
Yeah, I was interested to hear your thoughts too. So this would be a good dialogue.
Cool. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things I think that are constantly changing. Like one that Barry didn't list was geometry, which I think within the
Great
mountain
point.
bike world is massive and has really changed our abilities on the bike. I think if I knew what the next trend was, then I would invent it. I mean, right? Because like all of these
Sure.
things, when I look at it, thinking about like rolling resistance, I mean, it seems obvious, but also it takes a lot to design something that's actually that much faster. So these trends they're well thought out and difficult to predict sometimes. But I think we're actually going to start seeing more of a cycle. And so some of what I think we've seen over the years, especially in the mountain bike and gravel space, is because we've had so many technological advances that have very objectively helped us get faster. Things like, more suspension, dropper seat posts, tires are wider,
Drive chains
tires
are heavier.
Yeah, tires with like more protection and stuff. Bikes in some ways have actually gotten a little bit heavier, and I think we're going to go all the way back around and start seeing these things get lighter again with the same type of ability. Because I think this is a dialogue a lot at every race with athletes is, do I run the lightest thing or do I run the most cautious thing? Do I run the tire with the least rolling resistance and the lowest weight, or do I run extra sidewall protection? And I think that probably the next thing on companies' minds is to make it so you don't have to choose between those things. So I think we're going to come back around to the lightness goal.
I agree with that. I think that there's a big opportunity for that. Our bikes have gotten substantially heavier, to the tune of like, it's not a small amount, like 15% to 20% even in a lot of cases on the cross-country mountain bike side of things. And it's also worth stating, though, that particularly in mountain biking, a lighter bike doesn't necessarily perform better. Weight, when you look at the actual penalty in terms of time lost because your bike weighs an additional 4 pounds, is less than we think in our minds. But the one thing to keep in mind is that if your bike is really light and isn't planted, that sort of thing, it becomes pretty nervous and unreliable. You'll see like downhill bikes, for example. I know this sounds crazy, but they actually are adding weight, like significant weight, and they're using the heavier components that they can find because they're trying to get the bike to be more composed in those scenarios. And so I think there's a balance to be struck. Maybe we're at that balance, but I tend to agree with you that I think that what component manufacturers, the next marketing wave is going to be same performance at like a lighter weight. And I think that will happen. In terms of the innovation on the mountain bike side, I think that suspension, we saw, like you said, geometry really improve. And then over the past 4 years, and it's been much quieter, but we've seen suspension dampers improve substantially. Like they work so much better than they did before. Not a lot of people talk about it though, because I think it's a more nuanced thing to pick up on, but all of a sudden now all of our bikes are just like incredible in terms of how they handle stuff. And so much of that is because of the innovation from Fox and RockShox and other companies on developing suspension so it just simply performs better. Now I think that with electronic control over suspension, that's absolutely the next wave for suspension, and it will have this cascading effect on how bikes are designed. At least that's my opinion. I think that once you don't have to design a bike anymore to be able to descend and pedal well at the same time, and instead when you know something will be at the right moments, so it isn't being decided by the athlete, but at the right moments it will be in the right mode. You can design those modes very intentionally and very separately, and maybe our suspension designs will look totally different as a result because of the fact that we don't have to compromise like we used to. So I think that'll happen, but we'll have to see how that goes. On the road side of things, I really don't know where the next innovation will come, but I do think that we have a lot of room for improvement in the tires, in the realm of tires. Like we have tires that have really low rolling resistance, but they don't seem to like to hold on to the bead very well. And that's kind of scary. Or they puncture quite easily, like you were talking about before. And I feel like we can make a lot of improvement there. The roadside's just always going to be handicapped by UCI rules. And until those UCI rules change or they quit upholding things like, for example, like today, forcing Tadej Pogačar not to wear his skin suit because the shorts were like a mauve color instead of black or pink, was so silly. So as soon as they quit caring about the height of socks on your leg and silly things like this, and they start actually like driving forward innovation, then I think that we could see some changes in the roadside. But until then, I don't think we'll see much. I think the drivetrain differences, like we're going to get drivetrains where you can sprint as hard as you want and shift and it won't be hard, just like you have on transmission. That'll come to road, but I'm not sure of a whole lot. I think that, but the big one that's not really equipment focused is carbs. Like
that's what I was going to mention
totally
next.
changed,
I think
right?
because the road also especially is handicapped with these rules, I think that's one reason I feel like we're seeing just huge scientific, like physiological style breakthroughs, like with these things like, I mean, talking about like continuous lactate monitors and then simpler like carbs. Like I think we're seeing a lot of breakthroughs in innovating the way people train, in re-looking at the way we eat, just all these really nuanced things that it kind of is the new frontier. Like people are looking away from equipment and now looking at the body a little bit more too, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's a really exciting time. And on the carb side of things, it's just completely revolutionized the sport. Like you look at times and everything else. And I mean, this gets into the next question a bit here too, but you look at times on courses and they're dropping, like they're setting records all over the place. But when you look back at it, and we now know how performance enhancing it is to have more carbohydrate that you're taking in constantly, it makes sense like that we're seeing times drop, because before they were like, if they really wanted to spoil themselves, they would have a 20-gram gel on like a 6-hour ride back in the day, and that was it. Because, they had these terrible narratives like eating is cheating and all this back in the day that it was so wild looking at it now. It's like, y'all were just holding yourselves back so much. Like you could have been so much faster. Would have been really interesting back in like the doping era that was so prevalent in the 90s and into the early 2000s with cycling and road cycling in particular. If you could somehow in a parallel universe have a person not doping, but just taking in a bunch of carbs and hydrating correctly and to see how they would do. It'd be really interesting to see, but that goes into Jerome's question. This is the last one. He says, next time you have pro gravel racers on the podcast, can you ask them why they think we've seen so few doping positives over the past 5 to 10 years and why the American gravel scene seems to have none so far? Is it due to a lack of testing or new drugs that avoid testing? Or maybe it is due to the sport in general, or perhaps just Americans racing clean due to the Lance Armstrong fallout. Interesting ponderings there for sure, and reasonings behind it. What, as an athlete that's in the arena, what do you think about this, Hannah?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, so personally, I'm tested frequently. So like at UCI events, like nationals and World Cups, I get tested. You can also get tested at the Grand Prix races now, which I think is huge that they've brought USADA on board all the last 3 years, and athletes are getting tested at those events. Not everyone from the outside looking in knows that. So I think that's important for people to know that we are getting tested at those events. That's and then awesome. Also for me personally, I'm in the USADA whereabouts program. So with that, that means that if you achieve some certain status, whether it's world ranking or like a big, international win or something like that, you'll be put into the testing pool or the whereabouts program, where you basically, there's different levels and categories, but on the most, simple sense, you basically tell USADA where you are, at minimum where you spend the night every night. And then they can come test you at any time or at any moment at any location. And so it's a surprise, like they could show up right now and knock on my door, and I would get tested. And
quick
so I think
podcast break.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, I like to share this because I hope that it does inspire some level of hope and confidence in the system, because I think that USADA is working really hard to keep our sport clean. And I think things like the Grand Prix are stepping up to the plate to protect our sport as well, especially as, the prizes get bigger and the competition gets bigger. That said, objectively speaking, we still do see people testing positive, and that's not just within the cycling space. Like, we see it in sports like marathon running. So that means we know that it's still out there, that it's still prevalent. And that's a really harsh and disappointing reality. But I think from the athlete perspective, I can only think about myself and know that I'm racing clean. And that's kind of where my thought has to end, because I think as an athlete, it's a really negative headspace to consider or question if other competitors might be doping. Because one, it's devastating, and also it doesn't really make you better to think about. I think I'm best off just like hoping and assuming that everyone is clean, because I think it's also a super sad mindset. I'll hear people say after a remarkable performance, oh, well, do you think they're doping? Like, what a disappointing question. I understand why the history of the sport is why that question exists, but it's really disappointing that when someone achieves something magnificent, that is the first question to be had. And so I think for me, I just have to focus on myself and assuming that everyone else is also doing the right thing, because I think that's what creates the best competition. But as someone who's not, competing against us, like, you can have a different outlook. So I'm curious. I'm curious what you think about it, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I wanted to check my biases in this one. So I went back and I looked at, and you can actually go online. I'll try to find the URL and show you where they actually where WADA reports all the different infringements that they find against the rules. And so you can see that. And yes, people still get popped for doping. It seems like amateurs get popped more than professionals, by the way, these days, at least. So that's an interesting perspective, and I have no clue if that's perfectly comprehensive. I also don't know if there are other sanctioning bodies that are reporting this separately and it's not getting reported through WADA. I don't know how complete it is. But so yeah, to your point, it still does happen. But looking back, I looked back to all the way, and there's a Wikipedia article that it's not a comprehensive list, but it does cite a lot of the existence of doping in sport, and when it goes all the way back to the late 1800s and then comes up from there. And a lot of that stuff later on, way back then, they were not testing, obviously. And a lot of this is based on hearsay and secondhand reports and everything else and conjecture. But it used to just be that people died and their death was conspicuous, and it seems like they were experiencing some sort of weird phenomenon in their body that ended up causing their death, right? And that was kind of that was the extent of it. That's how you knew doping was happening, was back then. People are taking substances, and it was commonplace way back when. Henri de Grange, I think he was one of the organizers of the tour, I believe, and he raced the tour way back in the day. He's like a legend within it. So bad that I don't know more about it, but I saw a reference point to him writing down that just so you know, with the tour this year, a note to all the riders, no drugs will be provided, so you'd have to source them on your own. It was very much just a part of the experience way back then. Wow. Then fast forward and you get into the 80s and you start to see doping and actually becoming a thing where it's tested and people are caught and they are punished for it. Prior to that, you'd see where drugs were coming across a border and they were coming to an athlete, and as a result, that's where it would happen. That's when testing started to come about. And I'm kind of giving this longer history here to give us kind of a perspective. Once we get into the late 90s, doping cases increase in terms of people getting caught and in an infringement. It increases substantially, pretty quickly. And it gets to the point where in the late 90s, it's somewhere around 12-ish offenses a year that are on there. Then after that, you get into the early 2000s and it gets up to 20. And geez, you get into not long after that and you get into 2010 and up to there. And then you're looking at hundreds per year, right? After that, once you get past 2015 area, somewhere around there, it really starts to drop off substantially in terms of the number of people that are caught for doping. So I look at that and I think of like, what is the most likely reason for this? I think the most likely reason for such a substantial decrease is less cheating going on. I don't think that it's the most likely reason is that they have found ways to circumnavigate testing. It's certainly a possibility, and I would be a fool to think that it is, or to say that it isn't happening. I'm sure that it is. There are drugs that are beyond testing in some capacity. However, I don't think that this is just my personal opinion, but I don't think that that's the case, that like, that's the main reason why people aren't getting popped. I still think people do dope. I think it's much less. I also think that on the American side of things, like, and why you're seeing less of it in the Lifetime Grand Prix is, I think that it's a fresh culture. We see that, like, Lance Armstrong, and if you follow his story and his whole saga, he talks about the fact that, like, this is the culture of the sport when he came into it, and he bought into that culture, right? As did many others. And that was the culture of road cycling. And I'm sharing that whole long history because that shows that it's very much a part of the culture. Whereas here over in the US with this gravel scene, it was very much kind of like a ragtag group of folks coming together, creating this thing. And I don't think that it was built on this culture of substances providing performance enhancement. I could be super naive though. And it could be happening at a scale that I'm just totally unaware of. But I do think people are doping less. And above all, even though you can't be blamed for, like Hannah well said, you can't be blamed for having the perspective that, like, hey, maybe that performance was something that was, subsidized, so to speak, by performance enhancing drugs. Don't live that way. Instead, let yourself be impressed by performances. And if they did end up cheating, it's not your fault. You shouldn't feel like a fool for believing that they did something amazing. That's okay. Like, you live and learn, and you have no fault in that. I saw that, like, as a big response to the Lance era, where everyone was like, I feel dumb for this. And it's like, well, that's not the right perspective to have. Why would you feel that way? Let's believe in those performances. That's at least my perspective. Or perhaps it's rosy, but I don't think it's rampant like it was at one time. So hopefully that gives you a perspective on it, Jerome. It's a good podcast, Hannah. Thanks for joining me. Unbound is your next race. People can get in touch with Hannah, wish her good luck, follow along. You can do that and find her on Instagram, and we'll link down below to her Instagram there. Also, follow the Lifetime Grand Prix and go and support her sponsors, Competitive Cyclists, Pivot Bikes, DT Swiss, all the awesome ones, Volet Apparel. Go and support them because then that supports athletes like Hannah. And we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.